Welcome back to the Literacy Lunch Break. Today we sit down with Jennifer Burton, Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning, and Dr. Gyimah Whitaker, Superintendent of City Schools at Decatur, to talk leadership. Thank you both for joining us today. Before we jump in and begin to talk about leadership and systems, we always like to just get a little background about your experience in education and what led you to where you are now. So, Dr. Whitaker, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us, Marjorie. My background in education, I have often said I am one who has evolved into a leader, but I will always be a teacher. So I started as a fourth grade teacher in elementary school, actually here in the Atlanta metro area over 25 years ago, and then had progressive leadership opportunities within curriculum and instruction, specifically gifted education, in multiple districts here in the Atlanta metro area. And then did a little turn and actually went over schools and in the school side as well. So I was an area superintendent and an area executive director before moving into the role of deputy chief academic officer. In that role as deputy chief academic officer, it was during COVID. It was also the opportunity for me to really work with a very dynamic team around the way in which we teach children how to read. And so, with that level of success in that role, the City Schools of Decatur found themselves a superintendent had a proven track record around the improvement of literacy, the understanding of support systems in multiple tiers around academics and behavior and all of those sorts of things. And then finally, a superintendent who knew how to close achievement gaps for traditionally marginalized students. And that would be how I became the superintendent back in July of 2023. So I'm a little bit past my 1-year anniversary.
Oh, well, congratulations on that anniversary. And thank you for all that you're doing. And I can't wait to dig in a little bit more to talk about, what you did to make those changes and to ensure that all kids have access to become readers.
Of course.
Jennifer, would you like to give an introduction?
Yeah. So I started my career as a paraprofessional or a teacher's aide. That was kind of my entry into education, and slowly moved into teaching and coaching, and then eventually into school leadership. So I was a really proud principal of an elementary school in the metro Atlanta area. And then moved into district leadership in supporting early literacy and elementary literacy at the district level, and then had the opportunity to expand into assistant superintendent of teaching and learning, which that literacy piece is a big, important piece, but it is still a piece.
Exactly.
The role is really vast in covering all curriculum components in K-12. So I still get to tap into that literacy component, but my role has expanded across grade levels and content areas.
Yes, right. I think that's an important piece to talk about as we think of educational leadership. And I know this podcast is, talking literacy, but you made a really good point of it's not just one lens, it's not just one piece. And so I'm really excited to talk to both of you today because, this series is really about the importance of leadership. Access for all children. It really does begin with leadership. And so before we talk about, again, it isn't so important to have initiatives and to have systems and programs, but what we don't often talk about is the importance of leadership, like how to lead, how to make an impact, how to make a change. So as you think about, your experiences, and just, I love listening to experiences. I always love when our guests give their background, because a common thread is you both have served in multiple roles. You have multiple, types of experiences with both, being a leader or, starting where you're being led. So as you think about leadership, what would you say, is really important as we think about what leadership means, and really important considerations, any leaders listening out there, of as you're making changes, as you're making shifts, what does it mean to be a leader? What are some of those, almost like non-negotiables?
I'll start.
Yeah.
When I think about leadership, first of all, I always tell everyone that leadership matters. And it does matter because the leader is the person who ultimately identifies what could be the barriers to student learning. And when you identify that barrier, you also have to identify what would be that solution to that barrier.
Yes.
And so they are the person that grapples with those big, heavy, hairy concerns that are prohibiting our students from learning. Another key piece, and I've talked about this with our staff, is around leading change. And so in education, as you're learning and becoming a leader in progressive leadership, if you will, you learn about what students need to know and understand and be able to do. And there is so much around our curriculum and instruction lens, or even around leading people and culture.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the key pieces that I think is missing is change management training.
Yes.
And change management. So in that type of education, it's one of the things that I believe all executive leaders need. And that's one of the things that we jumped on very early on here in the City Schools of Decatur, because if you're going to make a change, there is executive education to teach
Yes.
you the best way to do it so that it will stick. And so how do you take any type of change through that filter and through that system? So those are two key pieces that I know every leader needs in order to be successful.
Yes. And I love that you're calling that, because again, any leader, not just in education, but I always say, I think education is quite different in the way that this profession is, your educators are passionate, and you're just driven by, making an impact. And so when somebody tells you, you know what, maybe the way you've been doing this isn't necessarily the way, it's very personal. And so change leadership is important across all boards, but I think it takes on a little bit of a special role as we think about education, of really how to manage that change. So I love that you brought that up.
Yeah, and I'll just add, for, when it comes to literacy leadership, and when you're in that change, you've really got to have leaders that are willing to get side by side with our coaches, with our principals, with our teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So when that change and these new great amazing things are coming, we're doing it with our teachers, because teachers, they want to do their very best by kids. But teachers have a lot on their plate,
Yes, they do.
especially elementary. I mean, they're teaching 6 content areas, it's a lot. And so we've got to do it with our teachers instead of, kind of wagging the finger and saying, do this. No, we're going to do it with you and support you, and lead you through this shift or change.
Yeah. And I think that's so important. I love that you shared that, Jennifer, because when we do it with teachers too, we recognize what's uncomfortable. We recognize, the challenges. I think it helps us, as you said, Dr. Whitaker, solutions, right? We're not just talking about problems, but we're talking about solutions. And when we're doing that as a team, we're doing that with teachers, that allows us to identify problems, but then again, bring those solutions, right? And yeah, so impactful. So as we think about that and the changes that, are shifting with the work that you're doing, and I think just overall in education, there's always going to be change. That's what keeps us great, right?
Yes.
If we're always staying in the same place, we're not moving forward. That's not where we want to be. So with City Schools of Decatur, what are some initiatives that you have started? Some systems maybe you've put in place. We'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
Yes, I'll kind of start with, and I alluded to a little bit to it earlier. So our board has been very adamant about our new strategic plan, and our strategic plan is all indicator, and in that we are focusing on student success and all student success. So our all means all is more than just a mantra.
Yes.
So, with that being the case, we are focusing a lot on a couple of things. One being literacy and the way in which we teach children to learn how to read. It is foundational for us that by third grade, our students would be skilled readers. Another key piece in this initiative work is around, and I alluded to this, the MTSS, or the multi-tiered support structures, and the ways in which we are designing systems to support our students who are at risk. And then finally, around closing the achievement gap. Mm-hmm. True mastery of content, not only for the sake of a summative assessment or a ranking of a school system or a school, but we need to ensure that every student that we graduate from the City Schools of Decatur is ready to engage in college or career or the military. And not only that, but be a true global citizen. And so we are doing what we call the dime. And that dime is we are designing the systems that need to be designed in those key areas. We are implementing what it is that we are designing. We are monitoring that system and the implementation of it. And then ultimately, we will go back and evaluate. So there is a level of accountability and transparency for all of our stakeholders around the work that we do. And so that's a high level of it. And Jennifer can kind of go a little more deeply around what each one of those key success areas for all really looks like.
Yeah, so when you think about our dime, our design, this year we're really pouring into our instructional coaches and making sure that our coaches know how to coach and that they have that science of reading knowledge. Because we know our coaches are the ones that are in the classrooms every single day being that support for our teachers. So as we are building our coaches up, we're focusing on one instructional routine at a time. So, for example, we're focusing on the transfer to text process this month, where we're taking decodable text, and our students are then applying the phonics skill that they've learned. So let's say short A, they're applying it in the text, and then we're working on building fluency. So that's our instructional routine. So our instructional coaches are going in, they're modeling, they're working side by side, they're making sure that our teachers have the right resources in front of them, and they're really coaching and observing. It's safe practice. So administrators, evaluators, you are not allowed to go in and observe transfer to text right now.
I think that is so important. As a former coach, as a former instructional coach, that was one of the biggest challenges, right? Is, yes, you're a coach, but you're also kind of living here. And to have that be like, no, like respect the process, respect the learning. I absolutely, not to interrupt you, but I just wanted to say like that has to be so impactful for educators.
Because this is our teachers, let's practice,
Yes.
this is, we want it to be safe and feel good. And so as we're coaching all the way through, also our teachers have kind of our coaching rubric for transfer to text. So it's no secret or surprise. Like, these are the things that we're looking for. These are the things that tell us that you've nailed it. You've done a really great job, and we're giving our students what they need. So everybody's clear and upfront. It's never a gotcha. And then at the end of the month, our instructional coaches come back to our kind of district-wide professional learning community. So all of the school coaches come back together and they say, okay, how did we do? And this school says, man, we did great. One teacher just needs a little bit more coaching that I'm going to follow up on. And we celebrate the success.
Yes.
And then we say, okay, now that we've gone through this month with transfer to text, we've got it. The coaches can go to their school leader and their principal and say, hey, this is a great time to do a formal observation on this teacher because she's gonna, knock it out of the park. Please go and see. And it's time. It's time to capture this formally. And so it really is. And then we start that cycle all over again. So we've designed, we've implemented, we've monitored, evaluated, and then we move on to the next routine. And so we're really in it together, supporting right there side by side, and then celebrating the success.
That's amazing. So, I mean, you did such a great job of explaining that and just the systems and the cycle and checking in and coming back. And I think that's a theme that I've seen throughout our series is really as we think about leadership and change, right? Is the support. We have to have a support system and this shared mission, the shared goal. And then here it is, but we're going to support our leaders and we're going to build the capacity of our coaches that are in the buildings because, when you're leading a city, when you're leading a district, you can't be in every classroom. So the systems that you're putting in place to ensure that that support is then spread out throughout each and every school, each and every classroom, but then revisited. You're not just saying, okay, this is what we're doing. And I think that's something, to really kind of highlight. We didn't just come up with a plan and say, we're done. Like, that's our plan. All right, this is what we're doing this year. And so I think that kind of leads to the next question. So what happens if, you have this practice and then you come back together and it's like, we're kind of noticing, we're kind of thinking about our own instruction, right? Tier 1. Most of our educators or most of the schools are really, this is a little more challenging than we thought it would be. Has that happened? And how do you overcome that challenge?
Absolutely. And that's part of the learning process. There are always going to be those that need a little bit more time or they need a little bit more support. And so absolutely. So our coaches, they have what we call coaching cycles, where this teacher may need a little bit more support. So maybe it is that we need to do some co-planning or co-teaching together. Or maybe they're getting hung up in one small component. So even though it's just one instructional routine, maybe we need to narrow it and say, let's look at just day 1 of the transfer to text process. And let's make it smaller and get really good at day 1 instead of looking at day 1, 2, and 3. So narrow it down. And that's the beauty of having instructional coaches, and then having a rubric or a checklist that breaks things down, because then you can narrow in. It's rare that you go in and you see, oh, there's nothing on here
Yes.
that we've checked off. And so let's highlight what we did get, and then build off of what's that one thing that might be the highest leverage move that we can make, to then make change in the classroom.
Yeah.
And I'll piggyback on that from a systems perspective, because when change is amidst, oftentimes you don't see the result immediately.
Yes.
So we go back to our community and really focus on awareness strategies, helping to remind the community that the world has shifted in the way we teach reading. An immediate change, an immediate result, more importantly, is not going to be something you will see readily. But it's key, once again, for that change management process to keep in their mind the desire. So the desire is to see the change. And I'm fortunate enough to have been supporting school communities in multiple districts in the Atlanta metro area. This is my third one. So I know there is a strong desire and support for all children
Yes.
to know how to read,
Yeah.
to be a true skilled reader. And so we help to shape that with our community and with the various councils that I work with, while we are building the teachers' capacity and their knowledge, in their ability, in that support system of reinforcement through coaching. So it's a both and when you're talking about leadership. It is the tactical pieces around the coaching, but it's also those adaptive pieces around change management that you have to continue to bring and communicate to the community.
I love that. We try to keep the episode short, but you are sharing so much important and impactful information. I do always like to just wrap things up, and I know hard sometimes, but if you were to give just one piece of advice, if someone were listening and it was just one takeaway, like this is the one thing that I want, kind of what you're already doing with coaching and support, right? We're focusing on one thing. There's a lot of things that have to happen, but if you could take away one piece today, this is what I would want listeners to walk away with.
I think the one thing is focusing on one thing system-wide.
Yeah.
And celebrating it when we get there. So there are so many things, there are so many resources, there's so much. But if our principals, our families, our teachers all know this is the one thing we're going to get really good at, and we're going to celebrate like crazy when we get there, it doesn't seem so daunting. So I just say, pick your thing and nail it. Yes. And go for it and celebrate it.
And I love that. Celebrate it, right? Yeah. Not just pick. I think I've heard that before, like focus on one thing and then, does that ever, sometimes I'm like, yeah, we're saying we're focusing on one thing, but we're not. So truly focus on one thing, but also celebrate it. I love that. Like celebrate success. Yeah.
And I would just say, from a systems perspective, it's around allocating.
Yes.
As a leader, it is so important that you allocate the resources that are necessary to do this work. And that could be in the tangible things, but it's also allocating the human resource, the coaching, the teachers, their time for the learning. And then also, I just said it, but allocate your time. Allocate your time to know, to learn more about it, to allocate the time for the celebration, and continue to advocate for all learners. So as you are allocating, never forget that you are also advocating, and you're advocating for that skilled reader, and it should be all.
Oh, I absolutely love that. Well, thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Marjorie.
Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we explore literacy topics in a snack-sized, easily digestible format.